Chapter 2 Cultural Change. We saw in the last chapter how colonialism brought in changes that altered the structure of Indian society. Industrialization and urbanization transformed the lives of people. Factories replaced fields as places of work for some. Cities replaced villages as places to live for many. Living and working arrangements or structures changed. Changes also took place in culture, ways of life, norms, values, fashions, and even body language. Sociologists understand social structure as a continuing arrangement of persons in relationships defined by control by institutions and culture as socially established norms or patterns of behavior. You have already studied about the structural change that colonialism brought about in chapter 1. You will observe how important those structural changes are for understanding the cultural changes that this chapter seeks to understand. This chapter looks at two related developments, both a complex product of the impact of colonial rule. The first deals with the deliberate and conscious efforts made by 19th century social reformers and early 20th nationalists to bring in changes in social practices that discriminated against women and lower caste. The second is a less deliberate yet decisive changes in cultural practices that can be broadly understood as the four processes of sensitization, modernization, secularization, and westernization. Sensitization predates the coming of colonial rule. The other three processes can be understood better as complex responses of the people of India to the changes that colonialism brought about. Social reform movements in the 19th and 20th century. You have already seen the far reaching impact of colonialism on our lives. The social reform movements which emerged in India in the 19th century arose to the challenges that colonial India society faced. You probably are familiar with what were termed social evils that plagued Indian society. The well known issues are that of sati, child marriage, widow remarriage, and caste discrimination. It is not that attempts were not made to fight social discrimination in pre colonial India, they were central to Buddhism, to Bhakti, and Sufi movements. What marked these 19th century social reform attempts was a modern context and mix of ideas. It was creative combination of modern ideas, of Western liberalism, and a new look on traditional culture. Sociologist Satish Sabharwal elaborates upon the modern context by sketching three aspects of modern framework of change in colonial India: modes of communication, forms of organization, and nature of ideas. New technologies speed up various forms of communication: the printing press, telegraph, and later the microphone. Movement of people and goods through steamship and railway held a quick movement of new ideas. Within India, social reformers from Punjab and Bengal exchanged ideas with reformers from Madras and Maharashtra. Keshav Chandra Sen of Bengal visited Madras in 1864. Pandit Ramabai travelled to different corners of the country. Some of them went to other countries. Christian missionaries reached remote corners of present-day England, Nagaland, Mizoram, and Meghalaya. Modern social organizations like the Brahmo Samaj in Bengal, Arya Samaj in Punjab were set up. The All India Muslim Ladies Conference was founded in 1914. Indian reformers debated not just in public meetings but through public media like newspapers and journals. Translation of writings of social reformers from one Indian language to another took place. For instance, Vishnu Shastri published a Marathi translation of Vidyasagar book in Indu Prakash in 1868. New ideas of liberalism and freedom, new ideas of homemaking and marriage, new rules for mothers and daughters, new ideas of conscious pride in culture and tradition emerged. The value of education became very important. It was seen as very crucial for a nation to become modern but also retain its ancient heritage. the idea of female education was debated intensely. Significantly, it was social reformer Jyotiba Phule who opened the first school for women in Pune. Reformers argued that for a society to progress, women have to be educated. Some of them believed that in pre modern India, women were educated. Others contested this on the ground that this was only for a privileged few. Thus, attempts to justify female education were made by recourse to both modern and traditional ideas. They actively debated the meanings of tradition and modernity. Jyotiba Phule thus recalled the glory of pre-Aryan age, where others like Bal Gadhar Tilak emphasized the glory of Aryan period. In other words, 19th century reform initiated a period of questioning, reinterpretations, and both intellectual and social growth. The varied social reform movements did not have common themes, yet there were also significant differences. For some, the concerns were confined to the problems that the upper caste, middle class, women, and men faced. For others, the injustice suffered by a discriminated caste were central questions. For some, social evils had emerged because of a decline of the true spirit of Hinduism. For the caste and gender operation was intrinsic to the religion. Likewise, Muslim social reformers actively debated the meaning of polygamy and parda. For example, a resolution against the evils of polygamy was proposed by Jahanara Shah Nawaz at All India Muslim Ladies Conference. She argued the kind of polygamy which is practiced by certain sections of the Muslims is against the true spirit of Quran, and it is duty of educated women to exercise their influence among their relations to put an end to this practice. The resolution condemning polygamy caused considerable debate in Muslim press. Tehsib Iswan, the leading journal for women in the Punjab, came out in the favor of the resolve, but others disapproved. Debates within communities were common during this period. For instance, Sati was opposed by Brahmo Samaj. Orthodox members of Hindu community in Bengal formed an organization called Dharma Sabha and petitioned the British, arguing that reformers had no right to interpret sacred texts. Yet another view increasingly voiced by Dalits was the complete rejection of Hindu fold. For instance, using the tools of modern education, Muktabai, a 30-year-old student in Phule's school, writes in 1852, "Let that religion where only one person is privileged and the rest are deprived perish from this earth, and let it never enter our minds to be proud of such religion." How do we approach the study of Sanskritization, modernization, secularization, and Westernization? In this chapter, each of the four concepts, namely Sanskritization, modernization, secularization, and Westernization, are dealt with in different sections. But as the discussion unfolds, it will become obvious to you that in many ways they overlap in many situations and coexist. In many situations, they operate very differently. It is not surprising to find the same person being modern in some ways and traditional in another. The coexistence is often seen as natural to India and many other non Western countries. But you know that sociology does not rest content with naturalist explanation. As the last chapter has shown, colonial modernity had its own paradoxes. Take the example of Western education. Colonialism led to the growth of an English educated Indian middle class. They read the thinkers of Western Enlightenment, philosophers of a liberal democracy, and dreamt of ushering in a liberal and progressive India. And yet, humiliated by colonial rule, they asserted their pride in traditional learning and scholarship. You have already seen this trend in the 19th century reform movements. As this chapter will show, modernity spelled not merely new ideas, also rethinking and reinterpretation of tradition. Both culture and tradition are living entities. People learn them and in turn modify them. Take the everyday example of how the sari or jainsem or sarong is worn in India today. Traditionally, the sari, a loose, unstitched piece of cloth, was differently worn in different regions. The standard way that the modern middle class woman wears it was a novel combination of the traditional sari with the western petticoat and blouse. India's structural and cultural diversity is self evident. This diversity shapes the different ways that modernization or westernization, sensitization, or secularization affects or does not affect different groups of people. The following pages seek to capture these differences. The constraint of space prevents a further delineating and detailing out. It is up to you to explore and identify complex ways modernization impacts people in different parts of the country or impacts different classes and castes in the same region, and even women and men from the same class or community. We begin with the concept sensitization. The reason for doing so is because it refers to a process that pertains to social mobility that existed before the onset of colonialism and persisted in diverse ways subsequently. The other three changes, as we shall shortly see, arose in a context marked by changes that colonialism brought about. This included direct exposure to modern Western ideas of freedom and rights. As mentioned earlier, this exposure heightened the sense of injustice on the one hand and humiliation on the other. Often, this led to a desire to go back to one's traditional past and heritage. It is within this mix that we can understand India's tryst with modernization, westernization, and secularization, different kinds of social change. Sensitization. The term sensitization was coined by M.N. Srinivas. It may be briefly defined as the process by which low caste or tribe or other group takes over the customs, ritual beliefs, ideology, and style of a high and in particular twice born caste. The impact of Sanskritization is many sided. Its influence can be seen in language, literature, ideology, music, dance, drama, style of life, and ritual. It is primarily a process that takes place within the Hindu space, though Srinivas argued that it was visible even in sects and religious groups outside Hinduism. Studies of different areas, however, show that it operated differently in different parts of the country. In those areas where a highly Sanskritized caste was dominant, the culture of the entire region underwent a certain amount of Sanskritization. In regions where non-Sanskritic castes were dominant, it was their influence that was stronger. This can be termed the process of desanskritization. There were other regional variations too. In Punjab, culturally Sanskritic influence was never very strong. For many centuries, until the third quarter of the 19th century, Persian influence was the dominant one. Seniors argued that Sanskritization of a group has usually the effect of improving its position in the local caste hierarchy. It normally presupposes either an improvement in the economic or political position of the group concerned or a higher group self consciousness resulting from its contact with a source of great tradition of Hinduism, such as pilgrim center or a monastery or a polysyllabic sect. But in a highly unequal society such as India, there were and still are obstacles to any easy taking over of the customs of the higher caste by the lower. Indeed, traditionally the dominant caste punished those low caste which were audacious enough to attempt it. The story below captures the problem. Kumud Pavade, in her autobiography, recounts how a Dalit woman became a Sanskrit teacher. As a student, she is drawn toward the study of Sanskrit, perhaps because it is the means through which she can break into a field that was not possible for her to enter on the grounds of gender and caste. Perhaps she was drawn towards it because it would enable her to read in the original what the text have to say about women and Dalits. As she proceeds with her studies, she meets with varied reactions ranging from surprise to hostility, from guarded acceptance to brutal rejection. Sensitization suggests a process whereby people want to improve their status through adoption of names and customs of culturally high placed groups. The reference model is usually financially better off in both the aspiration or desire to be like the higher placed group occurs only when people become wealthier. Sanskritization as a concept has been criticized at different levels. When it has been criticized for exaggerating social mobility or the scope of lower caste to move up the social ladder, for it leads to no structural change but only positional change of some individuals. In other words, inequality continues to persist through some individuals may be able to improve their position within the unequal structure. 2. It has been pointed out that the ideology of Sanskritization accepts the ways of the upper caste as superior and that of lower caste as inferior. Therefore, the desire to imitate the upper caste is seen as natural and desirable. Third, Sanskritization seems to justify a model that rests on inequality and exclusion. It appears to suggest that to believe in pollution and purity of groups of people is justifiable or alright. Therefore, to be able to look down on some groups, such as the upper caste, look down on the lower caste is a mark of privilege. In society where such worldview exists, imagining an equal society becomes difficult. The study on the next page shows how the very idea of purity and pollution are valued or seen as worthwhile ideas to have. It shows how such discriminatory ideas become a way of life. Instead of aspiring for an equal society, exclusion and discrimination seek to give their own meaning to their excluded status. In other words, they aspire to be in a position where people they can in turn look down on other people. This reflects an essential undemocratic vision. Fourth, since Sanskritization results in the adoption of upper caste rites and rituals, it leads to practices of secure leading girls and women, adopting dowry practices instead of bride price and practicing caste discrimination against other groups. Fifth, the effect of such trend is the key characteristics of Dalit culture and society are eroded. For example, the very worth of labor which lower caste do is degraded and rendered shameful. Identities based on the basis of work, crafts, and artisanal abilities, knowledge forms of medicine, ecology, agriculture, animal husbandry are reduced in the industrial era. With the growth of Indian Brahminical movement and development of regional self-consciousness in the 20th century, there was an attempt in several Indian languages to draw Sanskrit words and phrases. Crucial result of the backward class movement was to emphasize the role of secular factors in the upward mobility of caste groups and individuals. In case of the dominant caste, there were no longer any desire to pass for the Vaishyas, Kshatriyas, and Brahmins. On the other hand, it was prestigious to be a member of the dominant caste. Recent years have seen likewise the assertions of Dalits who now pride their identity as Dalits. However, sometimes as among the poorest and the most marginalized of the Dalit caste group, caste identity seem to compensate their marginality in other domains. In other words, they have gained some pride and self-confidence but otherwise remain excluded and discriminated. Westernization. You have already read about our Western colonial past. You have seen how it often brought about changes that were paradoxical and strange. M. Srinivas defines Westernization as the changes brought about in the Indian society and culture as a result of over 150 years of British rule. The term subsuming changes occurring at different levels, technology, institutions, ideology, and values. There were different kinds of Westernization. One kind refers to the emergence of a westernized subculture pattern through a minority section of Indians who first came in contact with Western culture. This included the subculture of Indian intellectuals who do not adopted many cognitive patterns or ways of thinking and styles of life, but supported its expansion. Many of the early 19th century reformers were of this kind. The boxes show the different kinds of westernization. There were therefore small sections of people who adopted Western lifestyles or were affected by Western ways of thinking. Apart from this, there has been also the general spread of Western cultural traits such as use of new technology, dress, food, and changes in habits and styles of people in general. Across the country, a very wide section of middle class homes have a television set, a fridge, some kind of sofa set, dining table, and chair in the living room. Westernization does involve the imitation of external forms of culture. It does not necessarily mean that people adopt modern values of democracy and equality. Apart from ways of life, thinking and Western influenced Indian art and literature. Artists like Abhi Verma, Rabindranath Tagore, Chandu Menon, and Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay were all grappling with all colonial encounter. The box below captures many ways that style, technique, and the very theme of an artist like Ravi Verma was shaped by Western and indigenous traditions. It discusses the portrait of a family in a matrilineal community of Kerala, but one that significantly resembles that very typical patrilineal nuclear family of modern West, consisting of father, mother, and children. You can see many diverse levels that cultural change resulting from colonial encounter with the West took place. In the contemporary context, often conflicts between generations are seen as cultural conflicts resulting from westernization. The following account in the next page captures this gap. Have you seen this or faced this? Is westernization the only reason for generational conflicts? Are conflicts necessarily bad? Srinivas suggested that while the lower castes ought to be sensitized, upper castes ought to be westernized in a diverse country such as India, this generalization is difficult to maintain. For instance, studies of Thisya in Kerala shows conscious efforts to westernize. In Ayutthaya, appropriated British culture as a move towards a more cosmopolitan life and critic caste. Likewise, Western education often implied opening up to new opportunities for different groups of people in Northeast. Read the following account. We usually refer colonial impact to discuss westernization. However, often we find new forms of westernization in the contemporary period. Modernization and secularization. The term modernization has a long history. From the 19th and more so the 20th century, the term began to be associated with positive and desirable values. People in society wanted to be modern. In the early years, modernization referred to improvement in technology and production processes. Increasingly, however, the term had a wider usage. It referred to the path of development that much of the West Europe or North America has taken, and suggested that the other societies both have to and ought to follow the same path of development. In India, the beginnings of capitalism, as we saw in chapter 1, took place within the colonial context. The story of our modernization and secularization is therefore quite distinct from their growth in the West. This is evident when we discuss westernization and the efforts of the 19th century social movements earlier in this chapter. Here we look into processes of modernization and secularization together, for they are linked. They are both part of a set of modern ideas. Sociologists have tried to define what exactly constitutes the modernization process. In other words, it means that people are influenced not just by a local but universal context. How you behave, what you think is no longer decided by a family or tribe or caste or community. What job you wish to do is decided not by a job or a parent does, but by what you wish to do. Work gets based on choice, not birth. On whom you are depend, on what you achieve, not by who you are. A scientific attitude gains ground. A rational approach matters. It is entirely true. In India, often the job we do is not by choice. A scavenger does not choose his or her job. We often marry within a caste or community. Religious beliefs continue to dominate our lives. At the same time, we do have a scientific tradition. We also have a vibrant secular democratic political system. At the same time, we have caste and community based mobilization. How do we understand these processes? This chapter has been trying to understand this mix. It would be simplistic, however, to term the complex combination just as a mix of tradition and modernity, as though tradition and modernity themselves are fixed entities, or as though India has or had just one set of traditions. We have already seen that both plurality and tradition of argumentation have been defining features of traditions in India. They are in fact constantly being redefined. We have already observed this with 19th century social reformers. This process, however, persists today. The box below describes such a process in contemporary Arunachal Pradesh. In the modern West, secularization has usually meant a process of decline in the influence of religion. It has been an assumption all theorists of modernization that modern societies have become increasingly secular. Indicators of secularization have referred to levels of involvement within religious organizations, the social and material organizations, influence of religious organizations, and the degree to which people hold religious beliefs. Recent years have, however, seen an unprecedented growth of religious consciousness and conflict world over. However, in the past, a view that assumed that modern ways would necessarily lead to decline in religious ways has not been entirely true. You will recall how Western and modern forms of communication, organization, and ideas led to emergence of new kinds of religious reform organizations. Furthermore, a considerable part of ritual in India has direct reference to the pursuit of secular ends. There also have been debate about what is seen by some secularization of caste. What does this mean? In traditional India, caste system operated within a religious framework. A belief system of purity and pollution were central to its practice. Today, it often functions as political pressure groups. Contemporary India has seen such formation of caste association and caste-based political parties. They seek to press upon the state their demands. Such a changed role of caste has been described as secularization of caste. The box below illustrates this process. Conclusion. The chapter has sought to show distinct ways that social change has taken place in India. The colonial experience had lasting consequences. Many of these were unintended and paradoxical. Western ideas and of modernity shaped the imagination of Indian nationalists. It also prompted a fresh look at traditional texts by some. It also led to rejection of these by others. Western cultural forms found their place in spheres ranging from how families lived to what codes of conduct should men, women, and children have, to artistic expressions. The ideas of equality and democracy made a huge impact as evident in both the reform movements and nationalist movement. This led not just to adoption of Western ideas, but also an active questioning and reinterpretation of tradition. The next chapter on the India's experience with democracy will again show how a constitution based on radical ideas of equality and social justice functioned in a society that is deeply unequal. It will further show the complex ways that both tradition and modernity constantly got and is getting redefined.